Welcome back. News and Talk 1380 WAOK, the voice of the community, calling 44726-1380. Get you involved in the conversation. And as Omari brought up before the break, the Republican Party really has started reminding people of the East India Trading Company. Now, why is that? What was the East India Trading Company? So when the British and the Dutch first started interacting with, I'm not going to say discovered, because that's the propaganda that we've been taught over the course of generations, that they discovered these empires. The Mughal Empire had been around for hundreds of years prior to the British getting there. The Indus Valley civilization that they were kind of descended from was one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. If you talk about the cradles of civilization, you're talking about Mesopotamia, you're talking about the Indus Valley civilization, you're talking about Central and South America, you talk about Africa. So this idea of white people showing up and discovering is the racist propaganda that we've been fed for generations to reinforce the conceptualization of white supremacy. This idea that nothing exists until white people find it. But that's an aside. But when they started interacting, the British and the Dutch started trading with the Mughal Empire. And then after a while, the British and the Dutch came to these ideas of saying, well, why are we trading and buying these things from these folks when we can just enslave them? Seems a whole lot easier to just enslave an entire people and conquer their territories instead of buying things from them. So that's what they did. They sent over a bunch of boats, a bunch of soldiers, a bunch of advanced weapons, and they enslaved the Indian subcontinent. But there are way too many Indian people there to try to rule them directly. So they outsourced it. They set up these corporations and allowed them to rule over these entire empires. And that's where you end up with the Dutch East India Trading Company, the British East India Trading Company, because they were ostensibly private governments that set up with a system called the Raj, where they were the rulers, and they took the pre-existing caste system, where the darker southern Indians were at the bottom of the caste system, the northern lighter-skinned Indians were higher up on the caste system. And then they turned them against each other. They gave certain privileges to the certain groups in order to subjugate the other groups. They did not care about religious borders. They did not care about cultural borders. They did not care about historic families, etc. It was all about the extraction of resources to enrich the corporations, and then the corporations enriched the British Crown. Indeed, for 300 years of the Raj, of British rule of India, what you saw was the Indian colonies were making more money than Great Britain itself. If you need proof of this, just look at today. Without the Indian colonies as they used to have, well, guess what? Great Britain is in a century of decline. Meanwhile, India is rising. India has the largest population on Earth. They've actually passed China now. They are the third largest economy in the world after the United States and China. They're one of the largest militaries, one of the largest navies, etc. So the only thing that was holding them back was the British. And the only thing that was propping the British up were the Indians. And the reason that this has an analogy to the current Republican Party is the Republican Party has outsourced governance to corporations in order to extract resources and extract riches. Because remember, all these ideological battles that we are discussing, they don't really care that deeply about it. What they care about are those $2 trillion in tax cuts that President Trump gave them without any spending offsets, without any concept of how to pay for it. What they care about are those Bush tax cuts that they got, that they never paid for, never considered paying for. You see, when they talk about the deficit and debt and cutting spending, they never say, well, so there's two ways that you're going to cut down a budget deficit, just like in your household. One could be spend less money. Two would be bring in more money. Now, the best solution, as all of you know, is to do both. If you see your credit card bills are piling up, Step one, stop spending so much money. Step two, get you a night job. Go start driving Uber, sell pies out the kitchen, do something, make you some extra money. So Republicans always say, well, the deficit and the debt are piling up. So let's take away early childhood education. Let's take away pre-K programs. Let's steal food out the mouth of children. Let them little people starve to death. They never say, well, let's raise taxes on corporations. They never say, let's make millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share. And so this is why we have seen governance being outsourced to these corporations. They don't care about what voters think because they've realized they can win without them. Remember, Republicans haven't won the popular vote in a presidential election since George W. Bush in 2004. And that's the only time they won since George H.W. Bush in 1988. So for the last 35 years, they haven't really needed the popular vote to stay in power. If you look at the United States Senate, Democratic senators represent 41 million more people than the 49 Republican senators, because Republicans don't need a majority of people. If you get 2 senators from each state, that means the 2 senators from California that represent, 50 million people, they get the exact same vote as the 2 senators from Wyoming or North Dakota that represent, a couple 100,000 people. So you don't need a majority of the people. You don't care really that much about governance. If you look at what's going on in the House of Representatives, it is a small minority. It's like 8 to 10 people in these extreme right-wing Freedom Caucus groups that are controlling conservative politics because they operate at the whims of the corporations that finance them. All that has to happen in order for you to win as a Republican is that one of these Republican mega donors, Sheldon Adelson or, the Koch brothers, etc., they get behind you, they pump money into your campaign, they send in consultants, you start saying the same Republican talking points, but then once you win, you are bought and sold by the corporations. That means that when it comes to regulations around health and safety, you vote against them. They talk about deregulating, unleashing the power of American energy. The reason Republicans have so many nonsense positions is because they are not based on logic. If you talk to a lot of them in dinner parties or cocktail parties, etc., they'll tell you they don't really believe these things, but it's all about selling it to their base because they've outsourced governance to corporations the same way that the British outsourced governance of India to the East India Trading Company. And the same way that resulted in the death, the destruction, the subjugation of generations of Indians on the subcontinent, and ultimately partition, which was just as destructive as the Balfour Agreement and the partition of Palestine, the same thing is happening here, where now these corporations are partitioning America. And that's why you have Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for a national divorce. That's why you have these militia groups rising up, talking about they want to secede from America, because they care more about upholding those corporations and those corporate interests than they care about anything to do with the American people. We're going to talk more about this after the break.